Alright, first off, I'm going to apologize for the audio on this because my roommate's stuck over the living room, so I'm filming this in the laundry room because that's the quietest place in the apartment building. I had intended to do this with the screencasting website, but I figured my phone's going to have better audio, and I'm just going to include photos of the slideshow, plus I'll additionally submit the slideshow when I turn this in on my learning space. Just wanted to give you a warning about that, because this is not what I planned to hand in. It's just that everything kind of came together in chaos, and I don't have anywhere else to film this or edit it, so we're going to laundry room. So, for the introduction, for the presentation outline, the presentation is divided into 3 sections, the first being the introduction to modern medieval music. It's going to introduce some of the popular inspired medieval bands from the past 30 years, with the oldest one being Outlander.New, and the most recent one being RTJ/the Snake Charmer, who I'll talk about later in the presentation. She didn't have a band icon, so I didn't include it on that little slide. So on the slide, Taverna is the most recent, but in the whole presentation, RTJ is the most recent medieval musician. Section 2 will talk about Scottish nationalism, and it's going to introduce the history that inspires the medieval music that I'm going to be talking about. And then I'm also going to introduce some of the basics of the Scottish nationalism movement in recent years, as well as in, like, by recent I mean like turn of the century, so like 1900 to now. And the third and final section is going to be talking about the modern Scottish identity, where I'll talk a bit about the Celtic revival, which plays into Scottish nationalism quite a bit, so that's kind of our connecting point. And then I'm going to talk about the rise of the Heritage Festival, as well as the shared struggle of oppression that makes Scottish music popular on a global level. So if we're looking at specific examples, I'm going to be talking a lot about Almanac because that's my example band. But other bands that are quite popular right now that consider themselves to be medieval music would include Banda Taverna, which comes from Brazil, and they're credited as being the band to introduce the genre of Scottish music as well as medieval and pagan music to Brazil. There's also Outlander.New and Fawn, which are European bands, with Fawn being from Germany and Outlander.New being from Scotland. So, while these medieval bands are primarily European, there is some like outer reach with Taverna, which comes from Brazil, and then RTJ, who's from India, who we'll talk about later on in the presentation. So, for my example band, I'm going to be talking about Almanac, which is my personal favorite medieval-inspired band. They were formed in 2005 in Glasgow, Scotland. Their frontman, James E. Johnston, openly supports the idea of an independent Scotland and used their music during the most recent referendum to promote nationalism and try to sway the vote towards pro-separation. They are marketed as primal and medieval, but Johnston makes it very clear that in the sense that they're a medieval band, they're drawing the emotional inspiration rather than the actual musical inspiration, because we don't have a clear idea of what medieval Scottish music sounded like. We know some of the instruments, but we don't know the music because it wasn't written down. So he says that they draw primarily from what they think the emotions evoked by music of that time were. They want to recreate that feeling for their audience. So a brief history of Scotland in terms of what is relatable to my topic in terms of this music is based around emotion and fighting oppression and gaining independence. So Scotland begins defending themselves against invading forces and oppression around 34 Common Era, when Emperor Claudius invades Britain. In 122 and 124 Common Era, 2 Roman defense walls are built to try and keep the Scottish from resisting, in the sense that like they were fighting too much and being too good, so they put up the wall to prevent them from taking any of the territory that the Romans had gained. The next dispute of note occurs in the late 13th century with the Battle of Stirling Bridge. And that's where we see the figure of William Wallace come into play. He is the inspiration for Braveheart and is noted as being one of the key fighters in the battle. The third event of note that relates to my topic would be the Jacobite uprising, which is by some considered one of the most notable events in Scottish history, as it leads to the disbanding of the clan system and the Act of Prescription. So in 1707, we see the official fall of Scotland to the English at the Battle of Culloden, which was a fight that took place after there was a lot of disputes over who should wear the crown. It had been worn by a Scottish king after the Tudors had no heirs, and then there ended up being some disputes because of religion after the Scottish king died. So it bounced around and ended up going to a German family, which neither Scotland or England agreed on, but Scotland was more so against it, and they wanted to place the relatives of the former king on the throne, regardless of religion. At Culloden, the clans that fought were butchered, to put it into plain words. They were fighting with more traditional methods and weaponry, whereas the British had more advanced technology and were an actual trained army. As an attempt to control and assimilate the remaining Highlanders after the Battle of Gabaldon, the British enacted the Act of Prescription in 1746. The Act and others of its era, because it had a couple variations, banned men and boys from wearing Highland dress, put weapons restrictions into effect for landowning Highlanders, and allowed the legal murder of suspected Jacobites as a defense measure. So the Act of Prescription was short-lived, but it left a lasting impact by the time it was lifted in 1782. Shortly after the Act was lifted, a movement known as the Celtic Revival began as a way to revive culture that had been lost after Culloden in terms of art, literature, music, and language, as during the era of the Act of Prescription, many people avoided speaking the traditional Gaelic language out of fear of prosecution. The first revival marks the creation of clan-specific tartans, as many people searched for a way to connect with their ancestors, which is a big thing about music, specifically album act music, is that they want to create connection and evoke emotion with the ancestors that they did not personally know, yet they are connected to. Moving into the modern era, our current Celtic revival started in the early 1990s with the publication of Diana Gabaldon's Outlander series and the release of Mel Gibson's Braveheart. Our current revival has both elements of the romantic and the grotesque. Gabaldon's book and the TV show inspired by it follow a woman torn between two lovers, one in the 18th century and another in the 20th century, one being Scottish and one being English. While Almanac draws on the grotesque, wanting to evoke warrior feelings and the noise of battle, Johnson models himself specifically off what he believes a Pictish warrior would have acted and looked like when he's on stage. When he's off stage, he's a very normal person who enjoys drinking tea and driving motorcycles, but his stage persona is meant to be Pictish in nature. The most recent revival has inspired people from outside of Scotland to use Scottish culture, specifically music, to express a reclamation of culture. So in terms of festivals, we start to see Scottish heritage festivals and culture festivals appear outside of Scotland around the 20th century, roughly, so late 1800s, early 1900s. Kind of like within that era, but they become more popular as we get into the 20th century. They showcase the culture and heritage of Scottish people, while also appealing to people with an imagined idea of Scotland. Hence the popularity of medieval-inspired bands performing at these events. They're trying to appease both parties in terms of educating, but also being entertaining. So now I'm going to talk about the woman that I mentioned earlier on, RTJ. In the topic of connection through oppression, Scottish people are thought of as having a fighting spirit and being strong warriors, yet they were ultimately oppressed by British rule. Although oppressed for many years, and some may say they still are because the English still have control over Scotland because the referendum didn't do what a lot of people thought it was going to do, the effort to reclaim culture after the Act of Prescription was lifted has inspired many others who come from lands once under British rule. RTJ, in specific, comes from India. Online, she's known as the Snake Charmer and is credited as India's first professional female bagpiper. She combines the music of India and the music of Scotland, as well as EDM music, to give it a modern feel while using medieval inspiration. She also uses a lot of medieval imagery within her music videos and her custom set of bagpipes, which hold a dragon head resting on her shoulder. Archie encourages her audience to cheer, dance, regardless of ethnicity or heritage, which is very in line with the Scottish identity in modern days of accepting anyone, because many of our family members were lost during Culloden, and clans formed together, they combined, they expanded to rebuild their families. Modern medieval music is not medieval music. It is a modern interpretation that draws much from stereotypes as well as what we think in modern era the emotions evoked would have been in the medieval era, in terms of battle music or in more lighthearted romantic music, which I didn't really cover in my presentation because I think it's more noticeable that bands like Almanac, Band of Taverna, Clan of Drama, RTJ, and Fawn are being medieval in comparison to other groups that draw on medieval tropes like Celtic Women and Celtic Thunder, which are more contemporary and less obvious.